Hi, thank you for joining us for the final panel discussion of the presentations at the Academia Via Serica 2021 conference. That is Textiles from the Silk Road, Origin, Transmission, and Exchange. I'm joined on this panel by distinguished scholars on Silk Road's arts and culture, Professor Amanda Phillips of the University of Virginia, and Professor Lanlan Kuang of University of Central Florida. We have 9 presentations to discuss today. That's quite a lot. Our panel experts will delve into the details of these, but we're going to start with a more general observation, along with a short discussion around the research philosophy and ethics question that all of us in this field must address. That is, how does provenance impact the propriety of research? In particular, we are looking at unclear provenance. That is to say, what are the ethics of research on historical artifacts and materials with questioned provenance or acquired through private dealings that may circumvent the intent of the 1972 UNESCO Convention? That convention is the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. We won't be looking at legalities since those things invariably end up in court, but instead, we're going to look at the realities for practicing scholars. Amanda, would you like to start, please?
Yeah, with pleasure. And I would just like to add to, I'm so very glad to be here, and I've enjoyed reading all of these 9 papers, watching the presentations. I think all of us have had a great opportunity really to see just smashingly fantastic objects, and also really seeing what we can learn from sort of the small bits and pieces of silk and cotton and ceramics, and stone carving and feathers and fur and all the good stuff in these papers. And so also a big thanks to Academica Via Serica at Keimyung University, and to the excellent organization of Rob, certainly, and also of Jimin Lee, who's really been with us every step of the way. So unclear provenance, the art market, illegal export of objects, and also I think more particularly our responsibility as scholars. So I think Rob made this really clear, and provenance is not really a matter of authenticity, right? i.e. is the material looking at fake or meant to deceive? Provenance isn't attribution. We're not really, trying to find out exactly where and when something might have been made when we talk about provenance. Instead, provenance, as we understand it in the 21st century, is really about who owns or who owned what, and also when, where, and how these objects came into collections, whether those of private museums or private individuals or even national museums. And this certainly pertains to textiles, as surely it does to antiquities, which regularly make the news here in the United States, also in the UK. And that's the context I'm working from. We should acknowledge too, there are different ways of thinking about this around the world. But again, issues that pertain to all of us today, or at least to most of us. So all of us, right? And I want to be sort of in the spirit of total transparency. I will say I work with objects in the art market. And I didn't really think about this very carefully until recently. Most of the stuff I look at is made between about 1400 and 1800. For that period, right, there don't seem to be too many issues of archaeology or looting or illegal excavation. The stuff usually isn't underground. Also, most of the stuff I work on has been in collections since before 1972. That's the cutoff date that was set in the 1970 UNESCO convention Rob mentioned about a legally acquired cultural property. Nonetheless, right, for all of us, there's still matters of sort of illegal or otherwise dubious acquisition. So I, for instance, have studied a bunch of Western European vestments, so garments made for use in a Christian context, that were made out of Islamic silk fabrics. And these are such instructive cases, right? Because they illustrate two related things. So one, textiles, of course, are meant to travel. In many cases, they were woven specifically for export. So that's the case for these vestments in the first sort of instance, right? Purchased somewhere, maybe in Syria or the Ottoman Empire, brought to Italy by a merchant around the year 1550. No problem there. But the real problem, perhaps, is how that vestment, maybe a chasuble, right, made it from the church into a museum. After all, it was part of a church kept in the vestry, part of what we think of now as the material culture of religion. Who approved its sale out of the church? Or really, was there any approval of all? Did the object, actually this vestment, just sort of go walkabout at some point when nobody was keeping an eye on it during a period of unrest, perhaps? Was it sold clandestinely by some individual who just saw an opportunity? So ethically dubious, perhaps, right? So it turns out that we as art historians we use objects acquired in the art market quite a bit. So of course, there are other questions here for older objects about the value of objects in and then outside the archaeological context in particular, right? There are repercussions to illegal excavation, right? First, objects are removed from an archaeological context. There's no record of their place, the strata, etc. So data from which we build knowledge as scholars is lost. Second, those doing the digging in the search for extraordinary or beautiful objects by whatever criteria, that's what they're looking for, things that are saleable. Everything else is discarded or checked away. So the whims of the art market dictate what is preserved and what is not. And last, we can ask ourselves, and perhaps this is especially true in the United States, who exactly is profiting from illegal excavation and the sale of artifacts? And I say the United States quite clearly. This is a concern that's absolutely been in the headlines in the recent years as the Museum of the Bible has been forced to return a number of antiquities to Iraq and to the University of Oxford. So whom did the museum pay for those cuneiform tablets, for those scraps of papyrus? Where did the money go? So as academics do, right, we may also play a role in raising the price of objects in the art market by publishing them, right? We give them sort of stamps of authenticity. We assign historic value to them. We bring them to the attention of the academy and to collectors too. It's vexing. It is totally vexing. And there are different standards in different fields, right? Classical archaeology, Egyptology, etc., all have different standards. The debate about working with en provenance objects continues, and it's gonna continue, right? We are not solving this here this morning or this evening, right? We also acknowledge that scholars working in China, Korea, Egypt, continental Europe, the US, all follow really different norms when it comes to this. There is no standard, and there's probably not a straight path forward, never mind an easy answer. We all love history. That's why we're here. We love objects too. And we are all, as scholars, really keen to continue researching and publishing. So for now, maybe textile historians, cultural historians, working in so many different places across the world, each with conventions and practices of its own, we should ask ourselves, perhaps, what our roles are and what our responsibilities are too, as we begin to sort of work through these issues. I've gone on probably a bit long already, but I'm going to say one more thing. I think this is a necessary conversation, and it's definitely one that's only going to gain volume in the next few years as a new generation finds its voice. I teach undergraduates in a class. We're talking about looting, objects, the art market, museums, and repatriation. And these 18-year-olds, these 20-year-olds are far, far more interested in these ethical issues than my generation was, and they are far more vocal as well. So I would say change is coming.
Thank you, Amanda. Lanlan, would you like to contribute anything?
My area of specialty. Hello, everyone. I will greet formally after I say a little to wrap this up. My area of specialization is really on the performative arts, which it deals with the intangible heritages. However, I think the same sort of issue does persist, and I often also bring sort of we talking about authenticity, we're talking about the agency, the group of community that is really in charge or have the power in, let's just say, naming the original or naming the ownership or in charge of the distribution network. And all the hit points that are already mentioned by Amanda in her very excellent introduction to the problem. I did, in 2 years ago, review a collection of chapters that deals with heritage management and in Europe, mostly Eastern Europe. So one of the things that we might also be, we probably should also bring into the conversation is to highlight the difficulty and challenges of not the convention itself, not the type of legal framework that we're dealing with, but in terms of dealing internationally and the difficulty of implementing in a local, very local level. So I think that those are some of the challenges that we are really looking at instead of, dealing with a scholarly community or dealing with the professionals that probably work on paperwork or the finances of transactions, but really working on the very local, the digging and who's working within the individuals that sometimes seems not so significant at first, but could change many of the end results. So my some thoughts on the subject.
Thank you. I'm going to contribute a couple of thoughts from the editorial side, from the journal publication side. Thoughts that directly impact the researchers, the scholars who are writing. And in some respect, we have to recognize the economics of scholarship. And we're in a world of publish or perish. So if you're not writing or publishing in whatever form you work in the arts, it may be doing an exhibit, but it's the same concept. Our publishing, our scholarship is in a way a kind of validation of this art market. The art market uses our papers to help advance the credibility of what they're doing. That might be in a formal authentication of a particular item or just the field in general. So we are looking at, on a publication side, some stricter rules. And we're starting to suggest that it may simply be not appropriate to publish things. And that's really detrimental to the scholars. So we've got this competitive, conflicting environment where we have journals such as, I'm sorry, I just lost my note, the American Society of Overseas Research, which sponsors a couple of journals. The Norwegian National Research Ethics Committee, which determines what is appropriate and not appropriate for scholars in Norway. The Dead Sea Scrolls community. These various groups, including Nature Geoscience, which is a very elite journal, are basically requiring scholars to specify What is the provenance of these items? How did you acquire it? How was it retained? Give us a longer history. Basically identifying whether or not the history of these materials that we are publishing were acquired and retained in an ethical manner. And that really is impacting a lot of scholars who never had to think about that before, or they have, through a museum or through some other form, had the opportunity to research something, and now others are questioning whether their research is appropriate. So that's kind of the ultimate question, and it goes all the way back to that horrid time 80 years ago when there were scientists doing experiments on humans and animals that nowadays we would say they absolutely violate all norms of ethical behavior. But the scientists justified it at the time as the advancement of science. And we don't have any other way to do this. So we're at this point where it's a slippery slope. How far can we go before we have crossed the abyss and we're now in the clearly unethical area? It's kind of a slippery slope. How far can we go? Any last words, Amanda, before we move on to the first session?
Oh, you're saying slippery slope, so I'm going to add my own cliche. There's a lot of gray areas here too, right? Absolutely. Just because things were acquired before, the 1972 cutoff date doesn't mean, they are sort of free of the taint of sort of coerced acquisition or what have you. So I think it's something, again, all of us, including myself, need to be thinking about all the time. And we're also supported in this in some ways by museums hiring experts on provenance, for instance, and beginning to do some of their own research too.
Thank you. Okay, so now we have 9 presentations or papers to discuss, and we, the panel, have set an order which is not quite the same order as you might have viewed these on the conference website. But anyway, we have our order, and so we're going to start with Professor Kuang introducing Berit Hildebrand's paper on the terminology of silks in text of the Roman Empire. Please go ahead.
Thank you for handing the mic over. And so formally greeting everyone, good evening from the United States. I am located in Orlando, Florida, and it's a great honor to join this conference virtually as one of the discussants. And the 4 articles, namely the terminology of silk in text of the Roman Empire, qualities, origins, products, and use by Dr. Hildebrand, East-West exchange and custom culture, focusing on an analysis of Taque Bustan relief by Dr. Chang, and Tent for the Afterlife, remarks on a Qinghai Sichuanese panel by Dr. Gasparini. And lastly, Intentional Identities, Liao Women's Dress and Cultural and Political Power by Dr. Xia. I am to comment on today on these 4 articles, and they could all be described as highly performative in both textual and visual sense. As Richard Vanguard approached the situational aspect of traditional Chinese scholar painting, that image objects should be understood in the surroundings in which they are performed. In other words, these papers not only provided the artistic, methodological, and the technical analysis of the subject, they also give us a well-established foundation of the information for reconstructing the context from which these materials emerge as a part of the larger and contemporary scheme of Silk Road studies that is the focus of this conference. I will now share screen with you with some slides that helps you go along with my discussion. And it is for this reason, it is highly appropriate to start today's discussion with Dr. Barry Hildebrands' study on the terminology of silk in texts of the Roman Empire. And the geographic area highlighted is one of the rare places where archaeological finds of silk of Chinese origin are abundant enough to be studied as intentionally imported merchandise. Being one of the oldest technique mastered by the human race, textile and its terminologies such as silk, linen, or cotton has given the vocabulary to some of the esoteric philosophical concepts. In one of the chapters that I work on the music as philosophical concept within the context of Chinese aesthetic, one of the key terms I highlight was the Chinese character ji, which is translated as scheme and originated in the shape of a weaving loom, a machine made of bamboo and wood for programming patterns of silk threads that also serve as the soft sounding string of the musical instrument, qin, the 7-string zither. As its connotation gradually expanded, the character ji, which appears to be a stylized loom, structurally as some of the commonest Chinese characters have pictographic origins, would become the generic term for machinery and wisdom in the Chinese language and culture. Similarly, a very large part of the vocabulary and imageries of philosophical and religious thought is taken from textile terminology in India. For instance, yantra, the esoteric diagram used for meditation, is derived from the Sanskrit word for the loom. In association to the Silk Road study, more specifically, Zhao Feng and Wang Le's 2013 glossary of textile terminology based on the documents from Dunhuang and Turfan would be a great example of study on textile terminology and analysis. Dr. Hildebrands' article provides us an interesting new angle as she investigated the terminology of silk as they were embedded in a variety of literature of the Roman Empire, thereby showing us the different applications of these terminologies in terms of the silk's quality, origin, product, and uses. The article itself is packed with details, as I'm showing in some of the examples that are here in the slide, with details drawn from a great amount of textual references. As we can see from her presentation slide, and provides the readers and audience plenty of material as evidence for the study. As we can see from the example she provided, her paper not only surveyed the basic lexicons for thinking and writing about silk, but by providing the literary reference, her paper also presents the forging of a language of fashion developed in the text of the Roman Empire, thereby associating forms of individual adornment to a collective desire for keeping up with the fashion trend, kind of with the trend at the time. As such literary tradition continues, we could perhaps also see this text by beyond records of textile terminology. In this case, the terminology of silks, but also as the social critics of the era.
Thank you. Are you continuing? Okay, that will be your next session.
Oh, I know. Yes.
Right. Are you continuing? Yes.
Is my time up?
Well, if you want another minute.
Oh, can I just? Oh, okay. Social critics. I lost my place anyway. So, critics. And we are reminded of, for instance, how textile entered Europe as booty. We were talking about Provenance, from the wars against Byzantine and Muslim controlled Sicily and southern Italy. Saracens in the medieval vocabulary often designated the Byzantine church in France in the 12th and 13th century. And Saracen silk is therefore often used in the medieval France to mean a large and highly specific rhyme of wealth, commerce, and luxury that exists in a very vague elsewhere beyond France itself. So the next presentation, which is a study done by Henri Chamier, looks further into the silk textile from the Byzantine period till the medieval period from excavations in the land of Israel. So I will turn the table to Dr. Phillips, who will enlighten us with her discussion.
Great. I'm going to add something about Dr. Hildebrand's paper too. Lanlan covered all the really, I think, major points, but how much I enjoyed it as an art historian too, and somebody who works just a little bit on the history of technology, as we see finished textiles coming from China and to a lesser extent India into Palmyra in particular. You don't want to talk about looting. And then also not only finished textiles, but skeins of silk as well. So, and what Dr. Hildebrand has identified as a damask woven somewhere in Syria with a couple of mistakes, but sort of attesting to the way that draw loom technology may or may not have moved along with silk as a material. And of course, really for this paper, who could resist this idea of silk as being very revealing as well. The full flower of her youth, indeed, on display. So the virtue of text is we get to understand how people thought about silk as well, whether it be positive or negative.
Precisely. And one of the things I took away from it on a linguistics level was the fact that the term silk is alternatively used to mean different things. What we would call silk. They had divided it up into many types. There was a different term for what seems to be the rougher, raw, wild silks of India and perhaps Egypt, as we'll hear in another paper, versus the more refined, cultivated silks of China. And the fact that there were silks that were blended with other fabrics, and there was another term for that. So that while we in English would say it's silk, and only the highest scholars would be able to analyze which types of silk, it seems that the various types of silk were part of the ordinary conversations in the Roman times. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on to the second paper, which is by Orit Shamir, and Dr. Phillips will be handling that.
Yes, I have the privilege of talking about this first, at least. So Dr. Shamir, this is silk textiles from the Byzantine period till the medieval period, from excavations in the land of Israel. So this is really 5th to 13th century CE, subtitled Origin, Transmission, and Exchange. So with Dr. Shamir's paper, we get something related but different. So not terminology from the written record, but extant textiles with secure provenance, which actually helps with attribution, meaning dating especially. We're pretty confident these textiles, for instance, were not made in the caves where they were found, but we can date them that way. So with this paper, we can sort of pose the question, what can archaeology do for textile studies in the Eastern Mediterranean? Dr. Shamir takes us through textiles, sort of late antique into medieval period, 6th to 10th and 11th centuries. We have 8 different sites here in Israel, and the textiles themselves are now undergoing analysis at the Nash Family Center for Ancient Textiles, and they're being conserved there as well. So as well as describing these textiles, which are otherwise unpublished, I understand, they're an important addition to the corpus of silks from the period, as well as these things. Dr. Shamir brings up I think, a number of really interesting methodological and historical points in the paper, right? First is, most of all, that these pieces of textiles are found in the ruins of houses or in middens, right? Rubbish heaps. So whether these are plain or fancy or cotton or wool or silk, of course, it means that we're looking at stuff that is used in every day. So not things preserved in princely or kingly tombs or made for palaces. And this is something, maybe as art historians, we need to look at a little bit more. Our coffee table books, our museum exhibitions, right? This is how we usually encounter silk textiles, emphasis on luxury goods for sure, and highly decorative items. But excavations really show us that everyday stuff was a little less fancy. So these fragments are much more representative of production and consumption, especially for those of us interested in larger social and economic questions as well. And so what Dr. Shamir also reminds us of is that silks are a relatively small proportion of the finds in some of these sites. And silk is, of course, historical record-wise, expensive compared to cotton, wool, and linen. And Dr. Shamir also is able, with this sample, to do a little bit of periodization, right? Something, again, that we're able to do because of archaeological context. And it is a small sample size, but it looks like there are shifts that come around the year 650, maybe with an initial, 630, an initial Islamic conquest, and then shift again, 120 years later, around 750, with sort of the expansion and consolidation of the Abbasid Empire with its connections east to Persia and the Indian Ocean. And this is something certainly that comes up in archival sources, namely the Geniza documents published by S.D. Goitin. We're talking about Jewish merchants in Egypt and far, far beyond. So a sense of change over time. Equally interesting is the point about rubbish heaps, right? Or other contexts in which textiles get chucked out. How do we think about these as historians of material or cultural heritage, right? We're looking at anti-archives. These are not stuff that were collected and kept safe, but rather discarded. So methodologically speaking, what do we do with this? We ask ourselves, how many lifetimes did these fragments have as they came, off the looms and were used and reused and reused, again, cut and sewn and stitched over and over. So it's a direct contrast to some of the amazing burials we're going to see a little later, but I think worth talking about in that specific way, certainly. And I leave it here to my esteemed colleagues to add.
Dr. Kuang, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, I think Dr. Phillips covers very well. I also was thrilled to read that the material, some of them was from the garbage, the trash, kind of like, which reveals so much about the so-called ethnography. We focus on the daily and everyday life, which actually in a way brings the audience, brings the students or whoever that is in presence of these materials one step closer to historical time that sometimes seems to be a vague idea, but this sort of connects and definitely plays an important part in recreating those scenes in sort of a museum or a field lab setting, right? In a way we can sort of apply them there.
Precisely. One of the other things that I took from this, I'd like to share a screen for just a second, is the mention of the Jewish merchants, but also the fact that really when we talk about the Silk Road, that doesn't do its justice. That we're really talking about a lot of products, a lot of ideas, technologies, cultures that are being shared through many routes, and that includes the sea, southern routes of land, northern routes of land. This particular image doesn't do justice to the idea that there are subroutes and sub-subroutes, places that were less frequently traveled, but still people went there. And we'll see some of that in the papers to come, where they talk about, for example, the sea route around India, the passages through the Persian Gulf and around to the Red Sea. So I just wanted to share this map and say that in our sequence here, the paper from Orit Shamir is the first to really say, yes, it's more than just silk. It includes cotton, it includes the spices, and it includes the concepts. So let's go ahead and move on to the third paper by Tatiana Krupa. And Amanda, this one goes to you.
Yes, I'll give the title. So this is Archaeological Silk of Ukraine as a Marker of Trans-Eurasian Contacts. And so another archaeology paper. Again, Dr. Krupa is giving us textile finds from secure archaeological excavations in Ukraine. And these, in fact, are most often burial sites. And they provide actually sort of a sharp contrast with those we've talked about with Dr. Shamir. Those are largely fragments from rubbish heaps and were probably otherwise discarded. These a different archaeological context, but what they have in common is that they're, kind of unstudied, or at least understudied. And Dr. Krupa is bringing them to our attention, also providing us with, really serious stuff with close chemical and technical analyses. And this is really important, right? Because these analyses, when published, will allow researchers to make connections with other textiles that share similar features, full stop, right? And for this reason, I think Dr. Krupa is really meticulous. She lays out a methodological approach for analysis, right? It's much better for materials such as this if we have a number of researchers, all researchers, sharing a sort of single set of questions, methodologies, test measures, vocabulary. It will make it much easier to compare and contrast finds and begin to build up a corpus of material. So Dr. Krupa, similar to Dr. Shamir, takes us through several periods in Ukraine, mostly from around the 4th century of the Common Area into the 14th century. So that's about 1,000 years of history. And most of the silk fiber here seems to be cultivated silk, i.e. produced as part of a system of sericulture, so not the wild silk. The fabrics are quite varied, even within the same burials. So from silk gauze to heavier brocades to densely woven plain weaves, certainly in a number of colors, and in some cases with gold thread as well. So here they may be fragments mostly, but they're not everyday items. And as a textile person, some really amazing weave structures here, including what seems to be a double-faced brocade in red. I was very excited to see that. So from this, we also learn what secure excavation can tell us, right? There's a compelling, if implicit argument. There is much to be learned from exactly where bits and pieces are coming from. So Dr. Krupa is able to reconstruct elements of a woman's dress from where parts of it seem to fall in the burial. And the finds from the Dnieper Basin, so this is Golden Horde period stuff, 14th century, Golden Horde being a Mongol offshoot, and therefore directly connected, or at least strongly connected with Yuan China. These seem to be especially rich. So a damask, gold embroidery, certainly, and a lot of gold thread. Otherwise, these people were not called the Golden Horde for nothing. And for this period in particular, 14th century, all of the textiles are made in East Asia. So certainly a testament to the East-West connection, trans-Eurasian. And Dr. Krupa points this out, that while historians have often followed silver from this area of Ukraine west, we could also connect the region strongly to the east as well. So I turn it over.
I wanted to share a thought tied back to the idea of the silk routes or the trade routes, is that Dr. Krupa's paper starts off with a suggestion that the Ukraine was perhaps one of the launching points of the Eastern goods into Western Europe. When we look at a map and we read more about the Golden Horde, we would say that, well, this was definitely taking the northern routes. And yet when we look at maps again, we could say, well, however they get there, they're going across the north of the Black Sea, I guess. Would that be right? Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. And geographically, it looks like that is a more challenging way to transmit information and goods, as opposed to crossing through to Palmyra and the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So I find myself wondering how far we can extend this argument. On the other hand, we do know that there are various goods that traveled through the Ukraine, as Professor Phillips mentioned, the silver trade, and that the silks are particularly rich that have been found in the Ukraine. So it starts to raise this question that we will see through the following papers, very different perspectives on some similar matters, and some very different matters that may sometimes be attributed similarly. It looks to me like this field has a great future. There's lots more work to be done. And just our first few papers have really kind of outlined some of the various perspectives that we're going to be looking at. So I really enjoyed this paper because while it was a bit more microscopic, technologically based than I expected, I think that it really is, as Dr. Phillips has mentioned, it's really pointing many other scholars into a direction and saying, look, we need to look at this side of things. It's not just the fashion, it's not just the trade, it's not just the pretty. We can start looking at material elements. And I thought that was a really valuable contribution. Dr. Kuang, do you have anything to add?
I have nothing to add. I think you covered it all very well.
Okay, well, it seems that Amanda's on a streak here. She's got the next paper coming up from Matteo Camparetti.
Yes, so I'll give the title. So this is Matteo Camparetti and Central Asian Textile Motifs in Late Sassanian Art on the Origin of Some Decorative Elements at Taque Bostan. So with Professor Camparetti's paper, we're looking at a site and not so much silk or textiles extant or even in terminology, but rather costume and motif as represented in relief carving on stone. So the relief carving on stone in question at the site of Taque Bostan, this is actually a complex of rock relief carvings near Kermanshah in Iran, and we're going to hear about it in the next paper as well, I believe. And in this case, Dr. Camparetti links the site itself with both very old local Mesopotamian traditions. This part of Iran is quite far west and south. So think Nineveh, for instance. He links Taque Bostan there, but then he also links it to much newer but more distant traditions from Khorasan or Eastern Iran, so in close proximity to Central Asia. So again, we're getting sort of this east-west transmission, but this case a little further south. And now I am going to attempt a screen share so we can look at exactly what Professor Camparetti is telling us about. Can I get a thumbs up from my?
That looks good.
Okay. Right. So there we have it. What we're talking about is what he's talking about really is textiles dress represented in the wild boar hunting scenes and how they help us figure out a little bit more about the scene itself or the carvings at Taque Bostan, namely that the carvings or this set of them was started by one individual who seems to have direct personal connections to Central Asia and therefore used Central Asian motifs in the garments. But then the site was sort of taken over and the carvings were redone by another individual, King Khosrau II. He took over the carving, he took over the garments as well, and their luck and glory bringing symbols. And namely this symbol here, this composite creature, right? Head of a doggish, lionish thing, wings, and this great sort of flat tail that always to me looks like a beaver, but it's apparently a peacock. So Dr. Camparetti here is working with motif, and evidence comes into it, right? He's bringing in coins, wall paintings, ceramics, tiles, rock carving outside Iran as well. And so a wide net for things that allow us to understand better the dress, the creature, and the meaning. So what about the meaning or the iconography of these composite creatures? Is it about the way they were made or how they were used and received, right? If we look at this tunic in particular, Dr. Camparetti points out that there are a number of things in it that seem to come from Buddhist art as well. So flowers, jewels, a specific type of belt, and also these composite creature. So face of a dog, wings, tail. And I'm an Islamicist. And when we look at this creature, we almost always refer to it as a simorgh or a senmerv sometimes. And it's certainly found on Sassanian metalwork, as Dr. Camparetti points out. And it's also found in Islamic art from Greater Syria, really less than a century after Taque Bostan. There it is on the facade of the Mashhad Palace, so after the Sassanian period. But maybe it turns out, at least Dr. Camparetti thinks we've been wrong all along. Maybe we should not be thinking that this composite creature is a senmerv at all, rather something else, and namely the embodiment or the manifestation of a Persian concept of glory, far. Far gives us the attribute also of a halo, something else we're seeing very much in this rock carving. So this paper is about the meaning of certain symbols and concepts among different groups, right, in different regions, about shared ideas coming out of epics and thought, epics such as the Shahnameh, for instance, about patronage and commissions, but also maybe to some extent about fashion. If this composite creature, the far, was so popular in Central Asia and it made it all the way to Southwest Iran, we have to ask ourselves, did the far appear on other things? We're silk designers and weavers, adding the far to all sorts of different kinds of textiles made for all sorts of different kind of people. We also, in this paper, just a little bit, and certainly in the one coming, and in another one as well toward the end, is it also a matter of Central Asian clothing in particular, and a general rage for all things Central Asia, Asian in this period, tunics and trousers specifically. And so I think we're going to hear more about that in the near future. And I turn it over again to my colleagues for their comments as well.
Dr. Kuang, do you have anything here?
Oh, yes, the Seymour is definitely one of the probably most, one of the most studied, I believe, like the creature, right? And when we're dealing with sacral design patterns, you can see it all over the place, not only in clothing design, but the carvings and murals and etc. So I think this research, this new paper sort of shine lights on a different approach and different takes, where he was able to combine sort of a vernacular, in a way, like vernacular literature's approach, in addition, like a local, very local gathering of textual information that transmits sometimes orally, not necessarily textually, in order to sort of build up a new sort of thread in tracing the transmission of the Seymour pattern. So another one of the highly inspiring paper, very interesting, very detailed, a lot of reference that he provides.
This paper was also very, I don't want to say it's very critical, but critical in a positive sense. And it ties back to our opening discussion on provenance. which is that here Dr. Camparetti is saying, we have been ascribing these various things, but we might have been all wrong. And we have to go back and look, and sure, it's on this stone and we know approximately when this stone was carved, but we don't really know the influences of this stonework. And particularly in the lower central panel, which he suggests was basically destroyed for one reason or another and recarved, was this a rewriting of a story? And therefore we are removing these influences from one part and emphasizing our new influences. So I thought that in that way, this paper really should cause all of us who are sure of certain things to at least critically reflect and question, are we assuming something that perhaps just because the literature and previous scholars have said it is so, should we not be questioning whether or not our assumptions are entirely valid? Our next paper is also by discussed by Dr. Kuang, and this paper comes out of Korea by Professor Keimyung. So, Dr. Kuang, would you please?
Yes, I will. And if I may, I'm going to share the screen again.
Sure, please do.
Right. So in this particular presentation, this paper by Dr. Chan, also we see the image of Seymour. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But her presentations also looks to the regions of Turkestan, and her research focused primarily on the analysis of Turkestan relief from the Sassanian Empire of Persia. And the readers of her paper will greatly appreciate this very well-crafted article on costume in particular, right? We were looking at earlier, like the first paper that deals with textual descriptions on some of the design and fashion and the usage of in record in the literature. But here we are provided with some visual analysis on the costume culture, which developed during the Sassanian dynasty. And to start with, Professor Chan thoughtfully laid the groundwork for some details, a discussion of the clothing element observed in the Turkestan reliefs, which provides much more information on the exchange of customary culture in regions where the Sassanian had cultural political influences. Right. As noted in the presentation, the elements were divided in two categories for analysis and discussion in her paper. Those of Greece and Rome in light, and then trousers and coats before the late 6th century, and those of Central Asia on tunic with side slit and bottom hems with pearl round pattern ornaments. The pearl round pattern ornaments is another one of the very popular patterns, lianzhuwen, the so-called lianzhuwen we see along the Silk Road. And Professor Chan finds that the basic form of the Sassanian costume depicted in Turkestan relief is the knee-length tunic with narrow sleeves and trousers. And she finds that in the Turkestan relief of the 4th century, the trousers of the gods and the kings were made of thin fabric and show many wrinkles that we are reminded of the characteristics that we find in sculptures and depicts of the Greek and Roman clothing. In addition, also the goddess of victory on the spedal above the Ark of the Large Grottos are a Greco-Bactrian style in which Greek-Roman style were fused with West Asian traditions, which is not that which kind of makes sense because in that region, we also find roots of similar, the Greek-Roman style in that region nearby. The custom elements of the Kushan kingdom, such as the round clasp decoration, were also conspicuous in the costumes of the kings and gods on the Taque Bostan reliefs. And among the custom element of the Taque Bostan, there were also elements observed in Central Asia, such as the side slit of the tunic and the hem at the end of the tunic and pearl round patterns, as mentioned before. So this is the second sort of inference that we are seeing. The first one is sort of, she described it as a foreign, more, well, in a way, relatively more distant in a way. The second one from Central Asia, it can be seen that elements of the Sassanian costumes, the side slits and hem of the tunic, are transmitted to the east and appear more active in Sassanian costumes. The pearl round patterns were activated and appear in Sassanian costumes of Central Asia in the 7th and 8th century. So her approach to analyzing the custom elements include descriptions of material, physical form, as well as pattern analysis. But with my background as a musicologist, what I found most interesting in her paper is the different groups of historic figures that she identified in the visual references per their custom design, such as the musicians seen here in one of the hunting scenes that she found, and also donors and servants. Here's another one that she used to describe to show that the design of musicians wearing tunic with a straight bottom end, and she argues that such custom is derived at the straight bottom end of this style of tunic was common also during the time found in the region. Here is another one that shows the different group of individuals that also appears in, but identify them through the musician's clothing. The Seymour, yes. So she also included slides that that discuss the Seymour. One of the like I said before, one of the most popular study, the bird pattern, design pattern. And Seymour and the pearl round pattern actually were known to be found along the Silk Road and reaching as far, especially the pearl round pattern, as far as Japan, as evidence of cultural exchange and identifiably associated with the Sassanian culture. And so by drawing connections between the various groups of cultural agents, with identifiable stylistic elements on their costumes, instead of focusing only on one specific group that is probably elite enough or important enough to be included in the artifacts. Her paper strengthened the goal of demonstrating such cultural exchange on different levels in the society that took place during this period, possibly through the Sassanian trades. So this brings us to further to looking at the cultural exchanges that facilitated by trade along the Silk Road, either by land or by sea. And I believe the next paper to be discussed by Dr. Phillips would be one that deals with the maritime trade route about silk and cotton textile. So here are some of the more Seymour patterns that also shows, you can see this, and duck patterns. We will see the duck patterns later in one of the papers. But turning to my colleagues.
Dr. Phillips?
Sure. Yeah, I was very glad to have another chance to consider Taque Bostan, and then also its connections to other visual material, both from further east, right? So we saw the stuff from Sogdiana, the Kizil stuff, but also further west as well. So Dr. Chung seemed like she was bringing in, or she did absolutely bring in Byzantine material as well. And so there's a great overlap between Byzantine and Sassanian weaving, certainly in terms of format, in terms of motif as well. And it's one that seems to extend, way past Western Asia into Eastern Asia, as we just saw, especially with those roundels with pearls in particular. And this is a motif that finds its way into Byzantine art, sort of all types, from the mosaics that we saw in Ravenna in this paper to any number of other things as well. So I was also interested to hear a little bit more in this paper. We got to hear about what the Sassanians took from the Parthians, so the dynasty that came before them, as well as connections to sort of Parthian heartlands with the Taque Bustan, which again is in this slightly strange place. And what this paper sort of reminded me of, and it came up with something that Professor Dickey said just a minute or two ago, is, we sort of think about these big empires, the Mongols with their sort of golden horn all the way from Beijing to the Mediterranean. But Dr. Chang also reminds us about the Kushan kingdom too. And I was reminded too of the Hellenistic sort of influence, right? All the way from what's now Eastern Greece to Afghanistan. And certainly it's sort of, not only it's long reach, but it's long reach through history as well, in terms of dress and in stone relief carving. So the paper certainly inspired me to think about all of those things in terms of dress in particular, and then on to sort of these certain elements that Dr. Chang really so ably picked out about hem and edging and decorative finish.
Precisely. One of the images that came to me as I worked through these papers was that we have traditionally thought of the Silk Road as primarily sort of an east to west route. And we understood that the Chinese goods and cultures and things came, towards the west, and that there were things on the west that kind of went east. But this series of papers and the Taque Bustan in particular really emphasized that there were, dare I say, melting pots. There were places where things from the west were wedded to things from the east, and it didn't have to be all the way west or all the way east, but the various empires and cities in the central area were borrowing from each other, and some of that was at the same time, and some of it was historical, and this particular paper kind of brings that more to the fore. Makes it a little bit more obvious that we're looking at several millennia of thoughts and cultures and ideas traveling east and west and north and south across this wide area. Our next paper is by Doraiswamy Dayalan from India, and Dr. Phillips will be doing the first presentation on it.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. So this is from Doraiswamy Dayalan, and it is titled Silk and Cotton Textiles, the Principal Maritime Trade Commodities of Ancient India. And I was so glad to read this, and also to hear more about specific geographies of textile trade, starting with the prehistoric or Harappan period, but ending really much later. We do go a little later. And this is specific, right? So it's about deltas and rivers and monsoon winds and the way things work. And I think with this paper, we open the question south to the so-called maritime silk routes, which are really also very much about cotton textiles made in India and which circulated everywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere from a really early period. And of course, not by themselves necessarily, but along with spices and pharmaceuticals and any number of other goods, including, of course, silk. So here, Dr. Dayalan combines archaeological finds, literature, visual and material sources, such as statuary, these little terracotta models, spindle whorls, for instance. And he combines these to make a case for the presence of cultivated cotton and a textile industry from at least the second millennium BCE, so 4,000 years ago. So for South Asia, really cotton is as early as silk. And Dr. Lanlan really does show that cotton production and then export, right, remained incredibly important from this period onward. And for those of us working on later periods, it's also, I think, perhaps a helpful corrective to understand just how very old cotton cultivation is and the incredible expertises and systems of knowledge that go along with it, right? How not just spinning, but also the bleaching, the dyeing, the printing, the painting, the finishing of cotton fabrics, and the sort of, again, atomization to some extent of these tasks within industries, but then also the different sort of specialties that different regions in South Asia were able to develop, again, over generations and centuries. And I'm going to share screen again to sort of look at a later example, remind us what these looked like, at least from a much later period. So we're in the historic period, the mid-1200s, and the incredible resist printed and mordant dyed cottons that made their way from Gujarat across the Indian Ocean, usually up the Red Sea, to Cairo, where ones like this and this one too were taken from rubbish heaps near Cairo. So with some of these later examples of these cotton textiles, we come back to some of the points raised first in Dr. Shamir's paper about contact between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean through Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Sailcloth is something that Dr. Lanlan points out is found at one of the sites along the Red Sea, but also printed cottons like this, published in a number of places. So with this, we understand also the breadth of what cotton can do, right? All the way from sailcloth to these relatively finer fabrics that were probably used for clothing or light upholstery. And we're reminded too, with this one in particular, and through Dr. Lanlan's paper, why Indian cotton was so desirable, right, for itself. And that also, returning to South Asia, that this was the only place that had the experience and the expertise and the structures of labor to generate something that looked like this. There were no imitations of this anywhere in the world that were successful until the 18th century. So that's sort of 4,000 years of cotton manufacture supremacy in South Asia, right? So it's totally unsurprising to us, I hope, that things like this were exported worldwide. So great image. I'm going to stop my share though and ask my colleagues certainly if they have things to add.
Dr. Kuang?
Yeah, I would like to actually elaborate on what you said before, that not many realize that it's more than silk. And here we have a paper that focuses on also cotton textile and the way that it's being brought to as part of the exchange in the sea route. I believe the author also contribute on the origin of silk to the journal back in 2019. So this is a gladly see a new article that takes a different subject and different approach and bringing us our attention towards the textile import and export historical elements.
One of the other things, it's just a sentence, I guess, a little comment made within that, again, stretches our bounds a little bit, is where Dr. Lanlan points out that Indian cotton was not simply something that was westward bound, but that Indian cotton and the trades and goods and cultures that were associated with it were also strong influence in Southeast Asia. And this also ties in with the idea of the spices roots, that cotton could go eastward, and then spices from Indonesia and other places in Southeast Asia and as far up as China could then begin a westward route, a seaborne route. So again, it's the idea that these the Silk Road or these routes are much more than just silk passing from east to west and the stories and the stops along the way. And so we're moving into the next paper, which is by Galina Lasikova and Olga Chernova. Amanda's going to present this one. And it, again, takes maybe a less discussed geographic region when we're talking about the Silk Road. Dr. Phillips, please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so this, I'll give the title, Identification of Animal Materials in Nomadic Costumes of the 11th and 12th Centuries from Eastern Turkistan. So Galina Lasikova and Olga Chernova. And with this paper, we get an opportunity actually to look at some intact objects, right? So 11th and 12th century clothing and footwear, now in the collection of the Marjani Foundation. That's the focus here. And they also bring in comparenda from a number of places, including the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, and a number of objects in private collections as well. So the authors here, Drs. Lasikova and Chernova, they're really focusing on animal products used in elements of this costume. So fiber, leather, feathers, fur, right? Similar to Dr. Krupa, they point out that the correct identification of these elements in the costume allows attribution, which is otherwise really difficult, right? We're talking again about lack of secure excavation and provenance for objects of this time and place. And perhaps more importantly, we're talking about objects that moved, certainly, within their own lifetimes and very much on purpose. So the paper casts quite a large net. It looks across really quite a large swath of Central Asia to discover the who, what, and when of the stuff. And maybe also they're looking at the where. The 11th and 12th centuries in this part of the world, networks extend across different parts of the Silk Roads. They link regions which I think to us looking at maps of the 20th and 21st century seem distant, but they remind us that this is not so. We should think about days' ride, perhaps, rather than geographical expanses. And those of you with better understanding of the Silk Road than me probably understand these oasis sort of situations that make things a little closer or make the networks a little different than the way we imagine. And anyway, so what Dr. Lasikova and Chernova show are that there are really specific branches of the road that do specific thing. And I think in this case, the where, these parts of the roads, are really usefully complicated by the fact that many of the people who used these cloths, these textiles, headgear, boots, what have you, were nomads. So they were moving along these roads over and over again at different moments as well. And as one would expect, maybe because of the connections along the Silk Roads, maybe also because of the ranges of these people, there are a number of materials incorporated into this material, from Islamic textiles to Chinese textiles to nomadic satin embroideries, also cheetah fur, right? So they're we would use the term eclectic. I think we probably shouldn't. Some of this is probably purposeful, and it really attests to exactly the acuity with which people acquired things. And this is also about breadth of trade too, and mobility above all. So what we see here, at least what I saw here, was an incredible appetite for beautiful materials, whether it's a finished silk textile or a feather or fur, even really good wool, something that comes out in this paper too. I would also say the state of preservation for these is really remarkable, and I think poses really interesting questions about what happened to the textiles at the point when they went into this burial, and how we think about them in terms of the afterlife as well. So I turn it over to my Silk Road colleagues here.
Dr. Kuang?
Oh, at this point, I felt that it might be feasible to organize a conference on the theme of hunting culture and animals and on hunting culture along the Silk Road, right? So yeah, the cheetah also caught my attention when I was reading this paper as well, and helping the diversity of the animal materials. I don't want to use the word for animal materials that present in this article really sort of expanded our imagination of how the Silk Road is proceed, right? Not main routes, but we also see the biodiversities that is delivered due to the explorations and let's just say accidental incidents that happens on the route that happen they discover accidentally, and therefore the dealing, the pattern of dealing, the materials that's been dealing might have changed due to all these discoveries. So it's another one of the very interesting paper. And like Dr. Phillips say, the materials are really well preserved, many of them. And yeah, so it's a valuable paper because it presents such a great amount of collections that usually are not put together for analysis and comparison. But now we have something that puts them together. So yeah.
Precisely. I thought your word biodiversity was very, very appropriate here. And the idea that there were subroutes and less traveled routes. And again, I'm going to point to the idea that there was a lot of, let's say, north-south traffic, that we had things coming from the Indian subcontinent and the plateaus of Tibet and Nepal that were moving north, as well as things moving east and west. And so it was really a much more, let's call it a bazaar type of market, where anything can be traded by anyone in exchange for anything. And if we can trade goods this way, then of course we can also trade our cultures and our technologies and our insights into life. And so there's a lot more that is suggested when we recognize that cheetahs simply didn't exist in Northern Asia, and there was quite a bit of travel here. And perhaps it left uncertain at this point is whether those cheetahs were alive or they were only the cheetah products as they moved north. It invites lots more questions and lots more studies on this really inspiring paper. Though the presentation was a bit more, how do I say? There was a lot of detail in this paper that was presented in a structure that wasn't what I originally expected. But as we worked through the presentation, they all started flowing together and started making more and more sense. So I really appreciated it as it went on. But in the beginning, I was kind of like, well, what's happening here? So it's the storytelling effect that some presentations are designed so that you know in the beginning what you're going to get at the end. And there are other presentations that kind of pick you up and carry you along a story. And so there was a different kind of presentation, which I really enjoyed. Our 8th paper is by Dr. Mariachi, sorry, not Mariachi, that's my Spanish background, Maria Chiara Gasparini. And Dr. Kuang is going to present her thoughts on this paper.
Thank you. And before I move on, I applaud both of you for narrating the last paper so in a very organized and clear way. I was also overwhelmed by a lot of the technical details also in that paper, and then come to realize how important they are when the paper is inserted as the group of paper that is being presented in this conference. But coming to the next paper, which has the title about afterlife, we are perhaps moving from the afterlife of animals now into the afterlife, because we are looking at, the afterlife, tent for the afterlife, as well as The last paper deals with funeral art, like in tomb arts. So let me start by sharing the next. Oh, so once again, like I say, my mind is now filled with very colorful animal patterns and hunting sceneries, and we will continue to see animal patterns and hunting sceneries in the next two remaining papers, especially ducks. I don't know why, ducks also. Instead of looking at animal materials used in nomadic costumes, this presentation returns to the graphic design application of creatures, including animals and plants, that have great importance in custom designs, and gives us some close analysis of the zoomorphic motifs, such as stacks, right? We're moving from cheetah to stacks, and rabbits, and once again, ducks. So the title, Attempt for the Afterlife, remarks on a Qinghai Sichuanese panel by Dr. Gasparini. She established some of the groundwork for her upcoming research actually on Sino-Iranian arts in the western region of China, which unfortunately is delayed due to the COVID travel restrictions. But nevertheless, this paper in particular describes the technical and iconographic feature of several different pieces of art compound textiles. The Tubo Turuhuan period span a little historical background here, span between the 7th and 9th century CE, when the Tibetan Empire reached the peak of its military and diplomatic capacities, as it established a significant economic and diplomatic tie with Tang China and India. So building on her previous research on Chuanzang region, did I include a map at the end of this. Chuanzang regions, Qinghai, Sichuan, Tibet region. The silk textile held in China's National Silk Museum, and more recently, excavated materials such as the items displayed for the first time, in Dunhuang. Professor Gasparini's paper presents the combination of traditional Central Asian zoomorphic motifs with indigenous Qinghai Tibetan elements, and the author identified on a large silk web face panel held in Hangzhou that represents also in the Stefan's collection that was on display in Dunhuang. We are looking at this. I was actually in Dunhuang doing fieldwork as a visiting research fellow at the time in 2019. And so I actually had the opportunity to view the particular panel that is discussed in her paper as part of the exhibition called Cultural Exchange along the Silk Road masterpieces of the Tubo period in person. So especially excited for me to read a sort of a new article that adds to the existing scholarship on the textile trade and cultural exchange along the modern day Xicheng Chuanzang routes. And noted by many scholars, study of Silk Road civilization usually have traditionally been centered on the Tang Dynasty, Middle Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean Sea, and giving little to no space to the ancient Tubo kingdom on the Qinghai Tibetan region, and especially as exhibition. So this particular one, organized by the Dunhuang Academy and the Pritzker Foundation, show more than 130 Tubo period masterpieces. And the exhibition was comprised of 7 sections. The prehistorical, here, this is museum floor plan I took a picture of when I was there. So 7 sections: the prehistory, Qinghai Tibetan, region, the Tubo Kingdom, ascending the historical stage, silk and gold ornament, nobleman's feast, nobleman's hunting. Here's another hunting scene, and Buddhism in Tubo, present-day Tibet. So most of these exhibition pieces are key items in collections of China's domestic cultural institutions and of overseas museums. I remember, I believe this is one of the articles that picked Dr. Phillips' interest on the subject of provenance. Anyway, so the geographic location of this exhibition, Dunhuang, is worth mentioning because it's highly significant. Dunhuang is an important sort of a strategic hub along the Silk Road, which was an ancient network of trade routes and cultural and exchange routes linking the different worlds between 130 BC and 1453 AD. So Dunhuang, this region, fell to the Tibetan during the Mid-Tang period, which is 781 to 848. During the period of the Tibetan Tubo Kingdom, which is 7th to 9th century, the cultural integration in the Dunhuang region was significant. And the exhibition presents the art and cultural achievements along the route over that part of the history. This is why in her study, Professor Gasparini argues that the large panels in the Stephan's collection, which was displayed, you can see two of them here. One of them is the one in the Silk Museum. The other one is from the collection. Is particularly important because it is part of a group of textile that combine Central Asian zoomorphic motif, often identified as Sassanian or Sigodian, with indigenous Qinghai Tibetan elements. Also at the exhibition, if I remember correctly, was a replica of the painting called Emperor Taizong giving audience to the ambassador of Tibet, called the famous Bu Nian Tu, painted by Yan Liben during the Tang Dynasty. So one of the popular reference, it is one of the popular reference for examining the cultural exchange with the Tibetan and the Tang at the time. So Professor Gasparini also used this painting, this specific scroll, as a visual reference that illustrates the Tibetan ambassador wearing a robe made of two types of textile, as it is seen in the famous painting. And she argues that it is likely that the Tubo Turenhun directly imported textile material from both Central Asia and China, since the Tibetan were already accustomed to Central Asia textile at the rise of their empire. So she also argues on the functionality of the panel, which was likely used to decorate the interior of a tent, possibly the type that in Chinese source is referred to as the golden tent, Jinzhang, used by Uyghur and Tibetan in the 8th to 9th centuries, which I think that it's a good suggestion pending further investigation, given the comparative analysis of religious and funerary traditions of the Tibetan beyond the textile panel. And in addition, as demonstrated in the illustrative examples provided by her, the practice of incorporating a pair of identical animals facing, here you can see that clearly, facing each other into a highly ornamental floral design or pro-round, there we go again. The pro-round design was commonly adopted by various ethnic groups and along the Chinese northern peripheral during the Tang period. So Professor Gasparini's paper contributes to the narrative on how the Tubo culture absorbed nearby cultures and established itself as a heritage created by constant cultural exchange and integration from the 7th to 9th century. Central Asia textile iconographic developed into a new form with the rise of the Tibetan in Western China in 7th century and eventually become part of the semi-nomadic people's lifestyle that found the Tibetan Empire. So in the process of forging an empire, we see the Tibetan aristocracy appropriate the items and cultural influences at their best from their surrounding cultures, and partook in the sort of also very cosmopolitan trend and design of that time, as depicted in the exhibition, as well as in the panel study in her paper. So, turning back to my colleagues on this particular paper.
Dr. Phillips?
Sure. I feel like with this paper, I think it was our final look at Taque Bustan with that tree of life motif. And also, I think the suggestion with those confronted animals in roundels too, about this incredible sort of textile landscape that extends all the way from really West Asia to East Asia in this period as well. I was also, this picks up on something Professor Dickey was talking about, interested again, to my 20th and 21st century eye, these connections over the Himalayas seem sort of incredible. But here we are, nonetheless, connecting places. And also Dr. Gasparini has proposed sort of this new sort of leg of the Silk Road. I'm doing this backwards on the screen, right? It's south and slightly west, and sort of proposed, and I think this is something we should take up, all of us at some point too. There are big parts of the Silk Road, there are strong connections, but let's also think about little connections and weak connections, or connections that don't exist for very long, but were nonetheless, perhaps within a generation or two, sort of come and go and have their minor impacts. I think a lot of us, myself included, for Silk Road studies, we tend to think across the centuries, but of course, human life is much smaller. And so what are sort of the more smaller single tent stories that can be told with objects?
Right, agreed. Fully, you've captured everything that I wanted to say. I'm just making notes here. And it's like, oh, she got that. So we're moving now to the final presentation for our discussion, and it's by Dr. Irene Shea, and Dr. Kuang, you're going to lead the discussion on this one.
Yes, I will lead the discussion on the last presentation, hoping my colleagues will chip in on a conclusion as well after this. But let me show the screen again. Here is the map that was provided. And Dr. Phillips is absolutely correct that this is the region that she's working on. It is relatively less studied in a way that if we are to describe this. But once again, as I mentioned before, we're moving from the afterlife into the tomb arts. So to our last presentation, intentional identities, Liao women's dress and cultural and political power by Dr. Irene Shea. So the title capture immediately presents you with a community, and also in terms of identifiable gender element that we are dealing with in her paper, which is also very helpful and exciting. Working on the visual narrative recreated to select examples, Dr. Shea's paper devoted to the funeral representation of women and their dress reveal how women's clothing might have looked, but also not how they were thought to look by the artists and painters crafting the image in some of the sites that she drawn her samples from. The visual archive provide important clues to the understanding on how perceptions of the female and their bodies, right? We are looking at specifically Liao women's and its relations to clothing changes over time. And we're dealing specifically during the period of time when the Liao dynasty 907 to 1125, conquer North China. And these changes are documented in tomb art, specifically those that portrayed the Khitan elite females. That's the group of females and their clothing that she studied. The Khitan Qiedan took the historical opportunity at the beginning of the 10th century and conquered North China and southern Manchuria and found the Liao dynasty, which stood in North Asia for more than 200 years as rival for the Chinese dynasties in the south. So in their effort to rule such a multi-ethnic and multicultural empire, the Liao rulers create a unique, well, at this time, unique. Later, we also see that in different dynasties, a unique dual political system in which two different sets of political institutions were established for the Khitan and then for the Han Chinese, respectively. So the Liao central government was comprised of the North and the South administrations, as indicated in her paper. Right, the northern administration was responsible for Khitan and other nomadic tribes, while the southern administrated Han Chinese and Bohai. This geographic marker, here is where I chip in a little. This geographic marker of the north and the south is in fact of great importance when studying geographic politicals and geographic cultures associating with China, because disproportionately important in Chinese literary history. The southern region, in general, the south of Yangtze in general later on, or the south in general, is highly romanticized in Chinese literature and historical texts as a place of desire, which has attracted Normans from beyond the northwest borderland for centuries. And the Northland conjure the idea of sort of underdeveloped wildness and tough muscularity through images of deserts and mountains, where for the Southland invokes the aesthetic notion of very subtle elegance, attention to details, and feminine beauty through images of like bridge canal towns in Hangzhou and Suzhou and Yangzhou, Nanjing, etc., and soft spring willows. And they all use, so the south and north, when put into perspective like this, serve as spatial metaphors. And many scholars, including Stephen Owen, have pointed out that as a conventional figure for pleasant sceneries and colorful festivities in China's Tang Dynasty poetry and Song Dynasty lyrics, the south of China is the routinized, and I quote, the routinized commonplace figure of desire, long since stripped of its original rhetorical significance. And by the northern Song Dynasty, Bei Song, it's 1036 to 1101, the concept of the Southland is best became sort of a simplified rhetorical statement to a process we can call so-called defamiliarization, a step toward making old literary convention newly relevant to contemporary experience for people. So it's important to note that Dr. Xia, for her paper, she covers all grounds with her presentation and acknowledge the challenges when researching the Liao and the Song era, as one who does study on these dynasties must also consider the impact of the complex Tang culture, which was known for its cosmopolitanism and contact with the North and Central Asia through the Silk Roads. And specific types of Central Asia designs, such as the clothing types and the fitting riding coats and trousers and boots, were adapted into the Tang clothing, which is unsurprising because those with a little background on the ancient history of the Tang would know the presence of groups such as Xianbei in the Tang royal house, supposedly. And over the course of the dynasty, Tang dynasty blend the Nomadic sort of influence with Chinese style dress, which posed the question of differentiating when you really want to describe the so-called Han after Tang dynasty versus the non-Han, because we already been to sort of a fusion stage for a long period of time. So anyway, returning to the paper, during the Liao on the local level, traditional tribe organs of the Khitan were kept parallel to the Han Chinese prefectures and counties. Many scholars have attempted to trace the origin and historical development of this dual system and to identify various factors which helped to shape its form. And Dr. Xia's approach to the same issue, which is the administrative policies in accordance with local customs. And in this case, the dual political system of the Khitan Liao dynasty. The highlight of her paper was in fact already reflected in some of the details on dress codes established by this political system during the Liao dual administrative system, as noted in the, say, official post section in the Liao Shi, basically the record of Liao. Then departed from there to the ceremonial grad section. And Dr. Xia's investigation also addressed specifically what Professor Wu Hong called the feminine space, where she devoted on the imageries of females the Liao during the Liao dynasty, but the Khitan noble females. Whereas Professor Wu Hong argues that the differences in types of painting executed on the interior walls of stone house in the Baoshan tombs create a feminine space for the tomb occupants surrounding the deceased lady with stories of historically famous and cultural women. In her case, in her study, Dr. Xia attempts to find out what constitutes a feminine space for a Liao noble woman. So stating how the Liao women were also active participants in important political and cultural activities, especially hunting, right? We have hunting and warfare. She argues that the Liao context allusions to culturally significant activities such as riding and shooting and wearing of the Khitan style clothing. So it seems to be essential markers of this particular, what can be called as feminine space, alongside with an appreciation for Chinese culture. So she provides some translated quotes from the Liao Shi here, as we can see. But like I mentioned before, it is highly complex and highly difficult to distinguish, especially when we are dealing with tomb arts lacking in versus with evidence from outside of the funerary elements. This is another example, provided that the court lady that is dressed in sort of the so-called sort of Tang Han style clothing. But it is important to know that during the Tang, we also note female dress and play polos, and also appears in traditional clothing that is non-Han in the murals and other artifacts. So this sort of concludes my review of her study, which it's highly intriguing because she shines light on particular group of individuals during a highly interesting time under a dual administrative system, which we will witness also during the Yuan Mongol dynasty as well as the Manchuria Qing dynasty. So I will hand the floor back to, I give the floor back to my colleagues at this point.
Dr. Phillips, any comments on this paper or any concluding comments on our panel?
No, I'll keep it brief for this one, right? I mean, so what Dr. Shea is talking about here, right? I mean, there seem to be issues of identity, you know, Khitan, Lao versus Song, and going back and forth in terms of dress, one impacting the other. And then there's also the gender aspect, which is slightly complicating maybe in some ways. But again, as Dr. Kuang just told us, you know, really intriguing. But what I'm also taking away from this in part is fashion, right? And desirability. When we're talking, I mean, sometimes I think all of us, and maybe this is something we can chat about in the concluding remarks, we use words like influence or appropriate. And what exactly are we imagining in terms of actions that lead to dress or elements of dress that are taken or borrowed or used or whatever? What are we imagining when we use those words exactly? What do we mean when we say them? Anyway, and for the rest of this paper, tunic, trousers, and boots, man. It feels like it's everywhere. So we're back also with Doctors Camparetti and Chong a little bit too. So, and then I'll leave it for now there.
There's a certain level of affinity for me with this paper, simply because being in Korea as I am, Koreans have a strong connection with this Liao Khitan region. There's a sense of ethnic identity. To some degree, there's some disputed history as to who has influenced whom, and even on a the history of nations kind of question. So that attracted my attention immediately. There were a couple minor comments made in here that also raised an eyebrow or two. One was the comment that Sogdian and Central Asian women's dress was often associated with the lower class, such as singing girls. And I thought, wow, we could go a long way trying to figure out what's happening there. But what it's really saying is that, again, even though the Liao region is far to the northeast along this Silk Road, there seems to have been strong connections all along the Silk Route, that the things from far west influence to the east, that the north and south connection is very obvious in this paper. But the fact that women were expected to maintain the cultural identity of Khitan, whereas men were free to wear whatever happened to capture their fancy, and maybe some suggestion that they more often wore the Song style clothing. What does that tell us? What cultural information is embedded here when we say women were expected to wear? There were women's dress norms, but perhaps not for men. That's my contribution to this particular paper. I will give each of the panelists a chance to make a final comment. I wanted to start by saying, as the guest editor for the next issue of the journal, I want to invite you to read the full papers. A number of them are coming in the immediately forthcoming issue. Should be available around Christmas, a nice Christmas present. And others will be coming along later. And of course, when we're talking about the Silk Road and the routes of travel, the journal Acta Via Serica, that's what we're all about. So you're welcome to read the past volumes of the past 5 years, and to be a regular reader in the future, and to submit papers. These presentations today, mostly focusing on textiles, are of course only one aspect of what the journal encompasses. So as a journal editor, I want to encourage people to read and share and think through things and ask more questions. Before we finally wrap up, Dr. Phillips, any final comments?
Yes. It's really about how the way we think, all of us, rather than any sort of anything more pressing. And again, it comes back to this idea about sort of thinking very broadly, but I'm also going to ask for a little more precision in some cases, because I mean, these topics are just so compelling. And I think it leads us in some ways to talk in hyperbole. And so there's so much about mobility and transmission and identity and strong connections through these huge areas. But then on a micro level, there must be all these little mechanisms working all the time. And so to ask for, I mean, is it possible to have a micro history of a certain part of the Silk Road? Does our material allow us to do that in terms of categories of sources? And I don't have an answer for that, certainly. This is not my field of research, especially, and then also to sort of push ourselves in terms of terminology. So what is, if this is such a big melting pot, what is a foreign influence? And what is not foreign? Are there alien forms or motifs or styles coming in? Or are we also incredibly connected that it's just endlessly syncretic in a way? Are there accidental incidents that happen, right? This is not all orchestrated. And again, I don't know quite where I'm going for this. It's getting a little late here on the East Coast, but those are some things to sort of keep in mind as we get, I think, and I'm talking really about myself, sort of carried away in thinking about these sort of centuries-long trajectories as well. Are there weak connections? Are there states that fall apart? Are there groups that disappear as we talk about these sort of exchanges across the world?
Thank you. And Dr. Kuang, any final comments?
Before I forget, I would like to start by thanking both of you, the esteemed colleagues that hosting this discussion session, and also thanking the colleagues at Via Circa and the Keimyung University and the team working to bring us together for this event and very patiently send all the papers and revisions to us. I think personally, I am most appreciative of, in terms of the diversity or the interdisciplinary that is presented by these papers, but also by your discussions today, that the way that you shine light on the ways that being a reviewer, being a reviewer could be also a lonely job just as an author, but the discussion session allow us to hear other reviewers' thoughts on these papers, which brings us to the concepts like Dr. Phillips mentioned, all the dynamic interconnectionness, right? At what point the foreign became foreign, at what point the international becomes national, or etc. And we already know that terminology, we start with terminology, and we all know that the idea of nation itself is the state, the nation, the region, etc. All these are terminology that are constantly in change, is a flux. And the way how we apply identity, or in some cases gender issues, to our study pose further challenges, not only within different legal frames, as we start also this conversation with the different legal frames or the language, but how us as researchers are applying those terminologies without blindly going into a narrative or oversee a discussion without acknowledging, once again, what you guys said, the details that needs to be made known or made clearly state to our students and to audience, that sometimes I think that that's also another part of the challenge, that we don't know who our audiences are. And in order to reach to the public audience as an academic journal, obviously we have our target audience, but Another goal of our research is to allow the larger audience to be able to acquaint with these researchers. So I also have no answer to these questions, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to raise them with you here.
Thank you. As we wrap up this quite long session, I just wanted to again thank Dr. Phillips and Dr. Kuang for joining us on this panel and all the work they did in the earliest stages of this conference, looking at papers, guiding us in ways of how we might proceed forward on this conference. And wanted to thank all the presenters and as well the managers and staff at Academia Via Serica who put in so many countless hours. For those who might not have noticed, all the papers were translated into Korean because in fact, we have quite a strong Korean audience. And so many hundreds of hours of work put in that we want to say thank you to those who are more visible and those who were perhaps felt invisible. Well, here we're bringing the spotlight to you. And so again, as we wrap up, thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you for staying through the conference. And we do encourage you to come back next year. And so at this point, I'll just say goodbye till next time. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Until next time.
Until next time.